Record to the cloud. We are live. All right, welcome to webinar hosted by RudderStack. And Max, thank you for joining us.
Oh, glad to be here.
Steer your customer data. That's a great slide. Okay, agenda for today. So Marketo is an extremely popular marketing automation tool, very powerful. You can do some incredible stuff with it. In my previous life as a marketeer, saw some really amazing things happen with Marketo. But the sort of the bane of existence for data engineers who are dealing with Marketo on behalf of their marketing team is API limits. Something we hear constantly about at RudderStack. And so we're going to talk about some unique ways to deal with that. So we'll cover how to extract data from Marketo with the API. We'll talk through APIs and rate limits. Those are two separate things. A lot of times you'll sort of lump those things together when you're dealing with limitations in Marketo. So Max is going to break that down for us. And then we have a really neat architecture with webhooks and cloud functions. And then we'll have a bonus round talking about custom triggers. So this is really cool stuff. I'm as a sort of recovering marketer, I'm really excited to talk about this, having felt the pain before. So let's dive in and we'll do some intros first. Okay, I will introduce you, Max, and then I would love for you to give a little bit of background. But Max Werner, I actually met him as part of the process of Proposify, a company he was previously at, becoming a RudderStack customer, and had the joy of sort of working with him to get data pipelines and everything set up. He's done work with all sorts of companies, including huge brands like Warner Brothers, who has a crazy data pipeline set up across, thousands, I guess, of different pieces of the puzzle there. And then also Obsessive Analytics is a consultancy that you run. And yeah, so without further ado, Max, thank you for joining. Do you want to give just a little background and talk about being a data engineer?
Yeah, sure. My background is originally starting out in web analytics and Google Analytics and playing around with Tag Manager and these kind of things, and that kind of naturally just developed further into the becoming the designated data plumber. When like Google Analytics doesn't cut it and it needs to be a little more advanced and all the problems that you run into then. And that's what I originally joined Proposify for, to help implement the CDP that shall not be named on this webinar. And eventually we also implemented RudderStack for different functionality. And then eventually from that I moved on to doing that same thing again for Warner Brothers, who it's a crazy scale. Like the analytics wing on Warner Brothers has like close to 100 employees alone. So it's crazy. And when they're dealing with event streams, it's terabytes and terabytes of data on like a weekly basis. So a lot to do.
Yes, very cool. And I'm Eric Dodds, Director of Customer Success at RudderStack. And like I said, I have a background in marketing, so really interested in this chat. So let's go ahead and dive in.
All righty. So let's start with the easy way to set up. It is just like the API, because we always need to get data out of Marketo. Sure, lots of the point of CDPs is to pump data into destinations, but you often want to have it like back out of those systems like Marketo into your warehouse, so you can run some data modeling on it, use it for analytics, reporting, and all these fun things, or to just have your own internal data sanity check. And well, you can really do it one of two ways. You can, build it yourself, which means you can do exactly whatever you want it to do. Like Marketo has a fairly robust API, both for importing data, exporting data, a nice bulk API. But of course, every time you got to build it yourself, takes some time. And of course, we've all never shipped perfect software with 0 bugs whatsoever. So the errors are like a concern, and of course, ongoing maintenance that comes with that. Much easier if you use a service to extract that data. Rudder has a great functionality called Cloud Extract, where you authorize your Marketo instance and it pumps it into your warehouse. There's other services like Stitch Data or Fivetran that do similar things for, of course, like other tools as well. Pros, of course, here is just it's a turnkey solution. You need to set up your API keys and your warehouse connection, and that's it. And because you didn't build it yourself, somebody else gets to maintain it, so it's just working for you. Of course, the con here being it's not free. Not that building it yourself is free either because of the time investment, but of course, there's always a cost to that. Now,
and
sorry,
one question there, Max. I'd love to just talk through really quickly a couple of use cases. So one I can immediately think of is getting a complete picture of the customer journey, right? So a lot of times you will have, and I'll just give an example off the cuff here. A lot of times you'll have different teams looking at different parts of the customer journey. So let's say you sort of have the top of the funnel. So that would include sort of web analytics, and then someone does some sort of mid-funnel conversion. Maybe they fill out a form, or request a demo or something of that nature. And then a lot of the nurturing and other components there would live in a tool like Marketo. And then maybe they actually sort of get into the product, and then you have the product analytics. And so just one use case off the top of my head is sort of getting an understanding of even answering questions of what emails has someone gotten throughout that entire process. That's a really valuable to know, but it's actually really hard to get visibility on that without, sort of either constructing it by hand or trying to unify the data. So I think that's one area where one sort of usage of pulling data from Marketo, but I'd love to know from your experience, what are a couple of other types of use cases where it can be really useful?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that insight is super important, right? I mean, like platforms like Marketo or HubSpot or whatever, they tend to have some analytics pieces built in where you can look at some of these reports, but a marketing platform with an analytics system built on top is just never going to give you the same insight as having just the underlying raw data in a warehouse and connecting it to a BI tool. So it's just better right off the bat there what you can do with it. Other use cases are you need to get data out of these systems when these systems do things to your data. Sounds a bit weird, but like use something like Rudder and you push your user information into Marketo. But it being a marketing automation platform, it does things to those user records there, right? There might be logic built into Marketo for lead scoring, different drip campaigns, right, and all these kinds of things. And like Marketo can just change data values on your user objects there, and that is data that you most likely want to have accessible in other systems. I mean, of course, it can natively integrate with things like Salesforce and push it around there, but if you want to get that lead score, for example, like out of Marketo and into your ticketing system like Zendesk or Intercom or something like that, you're going to be hard pressed to get it out there reliably. So having it just in your warehouse and then using like Rudder to sync it back into those systems solves that quite nicely.
Yeah, that's a really really good point. In that once you deliver data to a downstream system, it's not like that data is static in the downstream system.
Yeah.
And I would say, just from my own personal experience, and I think our audience would agree, dealing with point-to-point integrations among SaaS tools, sort of, I guess the least common denominator would be a lot of pain around like custom fields and field syncing, which is just incredibly painful. Data types even. And so I just think that's such a valuable way to think about architecture where you say your data in your downstream tools doesn't stay static. Point-to-point integrations are challenging. So get that data back into the warehouse, and then you can kind of do whatever you want with it and then syndicate it to downstream tools. Cool. Okay. I know that was a lot on this one slide, but I thought that was helpful context for me at least.
Yeah, and I mean the point-to-point is absolutely a problem because you have this issue that is you're starting to daisy chain systems together, right? Like with the CDP, it's a lot easier because you have a hub and spoke, system. But if you just say, okay, I have Marketo and I use Salesforce, so Marketo integrates with Salesforce. Salesforce integrates with Gainsight, and then you kind of keep daisy chaining your data around, and there's just so many points of failure that can completely, break that automation that you're trying to achieve. Whereas with the, a CDP in the middle, you can just say, like, on top of your warehouse, you push the same data. That's your source of truth. You push it into all of the destinations at the same time, and then it's not this like single point of failure chain.
Totally. One last point on that I think a lot of people have experienced is when you get into the daisy chain architecture, which is a term we need to trademark, by the way. When you get into the daisy chain architecture, it almost requires someone who has like a tribal knowledge of like all of the progression of all the connections and all the dependencies in order for the system to operate, right? So usually if there's a problem, it's like, okay, we need to go talk to this person because they're the one who sort of knows, oh, well, this was the workaround from Marketo to Salesforce. And then when it needed to go from Salesforce to Gainsight, we had to do this workaround because, is this custom field or this data type or this limitation or, whatever. And, obviously that's not the way to run a stack, but I think that's pretty common when you get into that sort of daisy chain architecture.
Yep.
I know you've never played that role, Max, but just theoretically.
No, never. It's not like, that kind of job puts food on my table. No, not at all.
Okay, cool.
All right. So moving on, like the problem, of course, with these kinds of systems, when you use the API, is that you have API limits and you have rate limits. And as Eric alluded to, those are different things that can each be their own significant headache. Right. So let's again use Marketo as the example, of course, here. The more services you try and integrate with Marketo, they're all going to consume your same API limit. So that's generally like, in Marketo's case, number of requests per day. Salesforce does like a rolling 24-hour thing with an hourly basis. It's weird, but whatever. So like that's your one limit. If you exceed that, things generally just stop working. Like, Marketo will reject the incoming API call. So if that's critical for your stack and you all of a sudden are not getting new signups or any of these kinds of things because the API is over the limit, that's not good. I mean, you can try and replay it, from your warehouse the next day if you have new limits, but that's, not exactly great. The other, of course, issue is rate limits. So that's, the number of requests per certain time frame, which Marketo also has, where you can only send, and it changes weirdly often. I think it's currently sitting at like 100 or 200 requests per 20 seconds. So even, like if you have a 100,000 API limit per day, you can't punch those all through in, in a few minutes because it will just have that secondary problem. So that's actually far more like nefarious of a problem because some of your things might fail if you have a high burst volume all of a sudden, but then a little later, like a few minutes, everything's working fine again. So also not a great thing. These two limits together, generally just make people like us sit there like this and try and figure things out because you just know that something failed at some point for some reason. And, Marketo also doesn't give you any great logs or anything on what failed.
Don't get me started on error logs from marketing SaaS tools.
Well, I mean, they don't exist, so.
So there's no place to start.
Exactly. So looking at this problem that you have these API limitations, and especially when you want to integrate more things with it or get more information out of it, like the logical question becomes like, how can you work around that? Well, lots of tools, including Marketo, have a cool feature called webhooks, which, I mean, for most people here on the panel probably know at this point, but it's basically just something happens and you get some payload that you can send to some URL. That's it. Like, Marketo doesn't care what happens at the destination. It will just fire something into the void. Doesn't even, I mean, it can handle responses and do things of it, but it generally doesn't care. So the idea here for this webinar is that we say, we take these webhooks and we attach it to some cloud function. And I'll show you on the next slide exactly what the process of that is. Your Marketo, your webhooks, your cloud functions. And in your cloud functions, you basically just run, your track identify calls or whatever you want, or any extra processing that you might be interested in, like a clear bit enrichment or something like that. And then use RudderStack to, like track calls, to punch it back into your database, into your warehouse. There is a great benefit to that. That is, webhooks are free. They don't cost you anything, and they don't have limits. And since Marketo doesn't really care if they succeed or not, like there's no rate limits or anything like that. So basically, and I'll get into like more details about like how to build this. But like I said, like the rough overview is webhook with the post requests. I mean, you can send it as GET requests too, but especially once you're sending your confidential user information and like more of it, you probably don't want to have that in your URL in the GET request. So use post requests and HTTPS.
Yes, I'll wait.
Security is important. GDPR fines are bad.
Yes, minor detail, PII in a URL is not the best practice. So let's walk through just
check your Google Analytics if you have URL parameters in there.
Yes, that is actually funny. Back when I was consulting and like doing Google Analytics audits, you can find some things in there that are like, this is frightening. Let's
credit
walk
card
through.
Information. I had a client once that had credit card numbers, full credit card numbers in GET, like a form submission with a GET on it. Yep. So use post requests and HTTPS is the lesson here.
Wow, that made me feel a little sick to my stomach.
It should. All right.
Let's walk through one quick example here with this architecture. So let's just, if you could just run us through using an example of a, something that happens in Marketo that fires via webhook, and then walk us through maybe some sort of track call or something. Just walk us through what that would look like an actual thing from Marketo.
Yeah, I'll have that just a smidge later on, actually, like the full walkthrough.
Perfect.
So we'll see that all. Of course, with all these things, these are custom built things, and we just said earlier, building custom things is bad, costs money, is error prone. So you might ask, why? Why should we do this? And I mean, I alluded to that already, but there's a couple of benefits. You are bypassing API limits. You can do a lot more things with it. Like your cloud function, you're not just restricted to taking that incoming data for somebody open an email and pass it on. You can call other services or do other things with it. You can even do a little bit of data cleanup if you want on that. You can directly like filter out garbage and don't pass it into the RudderStack. And generally speaking, unless you run your own web server that has a PHP file or something that is processing that function, it's very scalable and robust. So like, don't DIY that part. Use a service like a Lambda on web services, on Amazon, Google Cloud Functions. I'll be showing a little examples on Pipedream, which is another like product that you can do these things. So like, don't build that part yourself. Use a platform for that. Yeah, that's benefits. Fast, scalable, and you can do all kinds of stuff, with it.
The other interesting thing there, now that I think about the webhook essentially creating a payload that goes through RudderStack, is that you could also trigger things in other SaaS tools as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But if you use identify calls or track calls, depending on what destination you have that rudder source connected to, like that can be a very extensible part of like your ETL process.
Sure. Yeah, that's super interesting because obviously you want it in the warehouse so you can do deeper analysis, but there are certainly situations in Marketo where, going back to the point-to-point or daisy chain situation, like you want a combination of things in Marketo to trigger something in another tool in the stack or, update something or whatever. And that's a very neat way to sort of do that in the common paradigm of like an event stream going through the RudderStack data plane. Because a SaaS tool will accept it, just like they would accept an event coming from your website or app.
Exactly. And I mean, generally speaking, like the rudder integrations are more trustworthy than the point-to-point integrations.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm biased, but.
Yeah. So the workflow, and like we'll have step-by-steps for that in just a second, is basically like you use a smart campaign in Marketo, you add triggers to it, filters, if you so choose, activate it, create a webhook, write your code in the cloud function, and last but not least, again, add security to it. Because there's one important problem. Your webhooks are public URLs. If you just take whatever comes in and pass it through RudderStack, and that URL, somebody finds that or is leaked somewhere, you have issues. So add a little security on top of that, which we'll get over. Is very, very easy. So step one, let's make a smart campaign. Very easy. You can see like the orange part there, those are the triggers, and you can add as many as you want to a campaign, and filters if you so want. The couple of notes here are any and all triggers. If you have 5 triggers on there, any of those conditions being satisfied will trigger then the webhook. So it's not like somebody needs to like open an email and become a member of a program at the same time, but rather just any of those will trigger it. So keep that in mind. But the filters are applied to all triggers. So any trigger is activated, it needs to fulfill whatever your filter combination is, like 1 and 2 or 3 and 4, whatever. And very important thing, you need to get into the settings of that smart campaign and the bottom right corner you see and set it to every time, because otherwise your people will execute, each person will execute the webhook exactly once. And if you use that for something like open an email, well, that defeats the purpose. So generally speaking, you want to set that to every time for this kind of pipeline process. And of course, you can set multiple different campaigns with different triggers and filters if you so want. You can attach them all to the same webhook. Doesn't matter. It's all up to your personal organization desire in Marketo.
Right. So if you have like a pretty complex setup, you might want to add sort of like hierarchy, sort of develop a taxonomy around which types of behaviors trigger and have different smart campaigns for that. But you can send everything through one webhook, which is... You
can, yeah. I mean, depending on your complexity, of course, you might want to create like a couple of different ones. It's not exactly difficult to create multiple, like Lambda functions or what have you that handle things slightly differently. But if you, want to send them all to the same time, and we'll show you in just a sec how you can actually make that still organized when we get to like the actual webhook part. And like, trigger warning, this looks real ugly. So this is the like edit webhook interface in beautiful Marketo. The URL is the URL that you will have to attach to your cloud function. So I again used Pipedream here, but this would be your public cloud function URL for Google. If you want to use AWS, you have to connect it to the AWS API gateway. That gives you a URL to then connect to a Lambda function and pass it on. Can you set your request type again, post for PII information, and make sure it's an HTTPS URL. The template part here is the really neat part. Marketo, like most systems that offer webhook functionality, is just here's the thing that sends a webhook and you can see whatever it spits out. Like sometimes they provide you documentation if they're graceful, but generally speaking, it's just you get what it is. Marketo, you can actually customize exactly what you want to get. With this token feature, which is basically any field that you have in Marketo, and even some meta things like, campaign name and default values, you can customize the actual payload you're sending to the webhook. Which has the benefit that, like, if you do want to send multiple different campaigns to a webhook, then including that campaign name or ID in the template here lets your cloud function then do different things based on that, right? You can have a switch or an if statement or whatever on that key, and execute slightly different logic if you want to use the same webhook. Again, it all depends on like your scale, right? And how complex your workflows are. If you want to use multiple webhooks or just one.
Yeah, no, I love this because I'm thinking about the data engineer's perspective and setting up this pipeline, and it just makes it really easy to have basically a shared spec between, marketing, data engineers, and then, analysts or other people downstream who are going to be using the data in the warehouse or even in a SaaS tool. And sort of in many ways, sort of the liquid tag nature of the tokens in Marketo make it really easy to sort of collaborate on what the payload looks like.
Exactly. And you add new fields to Marketo, easy peasy, right? You just throw it in here as well. It makes the writing of the template a bit hard because, again, we want to make this all JSON encoded. So that's why you see it kind of looks JSON-y, but then, has these tokens in there. Just use a code editor, do it in there nicely, like tabbed out and everything, and then just paste it back in. It's probably easier than to just write it in here, because you of course have no syntax highlighting or code completion here. It's super extensible. Really, really good to use. Like I said, you just, again, trial and error. You need to actually write your own like JSON payload there, because otherwise it'll just it'll exactly spit out in the webhook what you write in here.
Yep.
Typos and everything. So following the how to write then. So we have a webhook and we have a campaign. You go back into that campaign under the flow tab. You simply say call webhook, and select the webhook that you just made, or whichever one you want to choose, and then you just need to activate it under schedule. Again, that's very important. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen, and makes debugging hard as well. So activate it, and that's most of the Marketo portion, right? Your campaign that determines like which triggers and under what conditions you want to call a webhook, and the webhook that has the fields that you want to pass on to an external URL. Now we just need to handle that incoming payload. Again, for easy to view purposes, I use Pipedream because you have a very generous free tier, and you can do all kinds of little ETL logic there. So you create a webhook trigger there, and it just gives you the URL. Then you can pop over into Marketo. Of course, these specifics here will slightly differ based on what your platform of choice is, like AWS or Google. I know Azure probably has something like it. I don't know. But yeah, that's basically then it. Like, you have your trigger in Pipedream, that is the webhook, which connects to a simple JavaScript, or again, whatever your code of choice is on your platform of choice. And then it can become as simple as you want it to be. If you have a very basic trigger system that is just, I want to know, they open an email, which email it is. I want to send a track event that is, this person opened this email. That's all you need, right? You initiate your analytics SDK, you give it the right key and the data plane URI, and make your track call happen. As soon as that's there and your campaign is active, data will start flowing right in.
Love it. I mean, it's just, it sounds so simple when you say, wow, it'd be great to send a track call every time someone opens an email, but it's kind of hard. But this is a really, really elegant way to handle that.
Yeah, as important as it is, like, you don't DIY this part here, like that Cloud Function platform, right? Because like the part that makes it so nice and elegant is like that these
Sure.
These things exist, right? Like the scalability, the security parts, the SSL certificate for the endpoint, right? You don't have to worry about any of that. It just exists.
Sure.
And it's generally also really easy to put extra security in.
Yeah, I was going to say the security is huge. And then we all know that you get it set up the first time and you start sending data, and then you go through the feedback loops of, well, we need to add this or we need to add this and all of that. And if you're, sort of trying to maintain infrastructure, but also maintain data integrity and provide value to downstream teams, those are really hard to do both of those at the same time, especially if there's an option that just sort of outsources the infrastructure piece for you.
Yeah. All right. So speaking of security, though, again, your webhook is a public URL. If you, as like what I just had here, the little code that just says, client.track, there's no security in here whatsoever. Anything that comes through, it'll look for the payload in the body, in this case for some keys. So if they don't exist, it might error out. But generally speaking, it will just execute that code regardless of who's sending the data. So let's add some security to that. Again, Marketo actually has a neat feature where you can set custom headers on your webhooks that are included. So set that custom header to some API key, like you can, or like anything. You can, just don't make it password or something like that, but just generate a random string, attach it there. That means Marketo will send along that header in every webhook, which you then combine, you modify your cloud function slightly to directly say, if this API key is not what it should be, or it doesn't exist, just stop immediately. And that, for the most part, is all the security that you really need. I mean, if you have, you can talk to your Marketo account manager and get like the IP ranges that they send information from, and if you have like a security group on AWS or something that can send data in, like you can bolster it up even more. AWS API Gateway handles even like you can set API keys there, have it generate API keys that can be, you can do the rate limiting if you want, to keep track of what's happening. So like there's lots of ways to attach that, but basically the takeaway is don't just let it sit there naked. It needs to have at least this basic header, even if it's just some fixed string that you type in, just so that if somebody just tries to denial of service attack that URL, A, it's not going to break that URL, and B, it doesn't flood your warehouse with garbage.
Yep.
And of course, SSL only. Don't send data unencrypted. This is all customer data. This is great big old security pain point if you sent that unencrypted. Yeah, that's the basic workflow. We have some bonus stuff coming up, and like any questions so far? Crickets?
I don't see any on the chat. Yeah.
Well, let's get into some of the bonus pieces then, because you can do a lot more than just these standard things like open email.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah.
I'm excited about this.
Right. So, I mean, there is a whole bunch of really useful things. So what we've gone so far over, you can replicate a lot of that data extraction functionality, like fairly easily, like these things like, a data values update or something. You can keep track of that. Even if you attach a data value change trigger to an identify call, that's basically, like your user sync done. But as bad as point-to-point integrations are, people use them. Salesforce, for instance, comes with its own set of triggers where you can, in Marketo, actually react to things that Salesforce is doing to your Marketo leads.
Sure.
Yeah. So like, that's useful. Whatever is happening in Salesforce, you can do a couple things there. What's even cooler is, and now we're getting into this feedback loop, is you can set up custom activities in Marketo that, like if you want to track things manually. So generally speaking, if you send a track call to Marketo, it's going to ignore it unless you have a custom activity configured that matches that. Here's the neat part though. When you create a custom activity, that immediately creates a Marketo trigger like that you can then use. So like I have like the bottom right screenshot there, like an intercom conversation. So if you have a custom activity called intercom conversation, this will become a trigger, which means if someone performs that activity, then you can use that as a trigger to call a webhook. Yeah, be careful on your like feedback loop there, because now you can actually do something circular. But for the most part, like this is a very powerful way of extending the like that trigger catalog, even further, and really customize what you want to get out of it. Yeah,
that's very cool. I just have so many like little interesting use cases that are popping in my mind. I love it.
Yeah, and you can also error log. Because remember when I said Marketo can respond to non-200 status codes and like errors from webhooks? Like that's a trigger. So theoretically, you can have like a very simple trigger somewhere else that is just like, if the webhook is not 200, send this other webhook that is just logging your errors, and that can help you at scale see what's happening if you include that error message in the template. Then, so again, you can take a lot of the burden out of Marketo, and because like it has limitations. There's things that don't work for everyone. And if you just remove that out of the platform and move it into your CDP, not just is it in your warehouse and you can, use it everywhere else, but, it gives you just that flexibility and reduces your vendor lock-in, because the more logic you remove out of that system, the more you can easily switch it to something else if you have to.
Very cool.
Yeah. So that's basically it as far as this workflow is concerned. Hope that gives some people some ideas. Like, it's not that scary. It's not that difficult to set up. I mean, you have the slides and the recordings to go through, and happy hacking, I'd say.
Yeah. Any questions from any of the attendees here? Feel free to raise your hand or drop something in the chat. And we'd be happy to answer. Here's a question that came in. Are there any limitations around the custom activities?
It depends what you mean by limitations. Like they take a bit of configuring, but they're not subject to like API limits or something like this. Like you can punch in as many as you want there.
That's cool. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah, I think there was one question on LinkedIn earlier about this, where question about like Marketo discouraging the use of
there was,
APIs and are using the APIs or webhooks. And well, APIs a little, and hence there's solutions like this. There is one concern that Marketo does have, that is if your response time is bad, because if you have a large volume of API of webhooks that are being triggered, and your response time is too long, then that can error out on, and that's in the order of like seconds, multiple seconds per process. Then Marketo is getting finicky. So easy enough to like keep an eye on what your event volume is there, what you're sending through, and scale your solution accordingly. So for instance, if you get to do these like thousands and thousands of requests, or you want to do more time-intensive extra processing, maybe call some other APIs, you might have to scale your solution. For instance, Amazon has something like Kinesis, where you can just basically punch data in, it just takes it, and then you can do further downstream processing, like later on.
Sure.
Like there's alternatives to, like this, you can extend this like second half basically of this cloud function and processing part to make it like more scalable. Standard like Lambda thing, whatever, is gonna, handle hundreds of requests per second, no problem.
Yep. Sure. Yeah. But when you get into like multiple thousands of requests per second, you sort of get into like, potentially needing kind of the streaming service type thing if you're, like the Kinesis or Kafka methodology, if you're doing stuff at scale internally. Cool.
I mean, that's like literally enterprise scale. I mean,
Yeah.
like most mid-sized companies are probably not going to run into any such, like limitations.
Sure. Awesome. Well, this has been great. I learned a ton, and I hope that our audience learned how to do some really cool stuff with Marketo Cloud Functions and RudderStack. And let's do it again, Max. Really enjoyed it, and I would love to learn more from you.
Sounds good. Well, happy to be here anytime.
All right.
All righty. Have a good one, everybody.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Bye.
Bye.